Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Mixing Monday. This week we're going to be talking about SPL exposure levels, or SPL level exposure, or the exposure of SPL when using IEM monitors. We're looking at what actionable, measurable data we can be taking, and what kind of actions we can be taking to preserve the hearing of those that are wearing them, whether that's the clients that are on stage, whether it's ourselves, whether it's other members of technical crew. You know, we talk quite a lot in this industry about how we need to look after each other's health and safety, and IEM monitors are not really any different to that. They're obviously more of a specific rather than a general health and safety, and it's the health and safety of your hearing. But that doesn't make it any less important. In fact, it's probably one of the most important things to a musician or an audio engineer. So I am going to hand this over to Scott for 5 minutes, and Scott can take the floor.
All right, thank you, Liam. So I think kind of a good conversation we can start is like either things we can already think of or like things we've heard of, because I'm sure like some of us over these past half a year have been hearing different ways on how to do it or how we've done it. So I'll kind of just start as how we usually do with these things is my personal experience on how I save SPL levels. This more goes towards the monitor wedges because I haven't done a lot of in-ears. They've popped up here and there in my experiences. But the main thing I do, and this is, I think, as any mixer, I kind of learned this trick early on in my career, was when they ask for more of something, see if you can take away less of it. So if they're like, well, I want more snare, see if maybe like, for example, like another percussive instrument they need less of, like, I don't know, like take the bongos or the congas, maybe pulling that back in the mix might make it a little bit better. And another trick I kind of do is, this mostly pertains to wedges, so I don't know how much it'll work on IEMs, but I never start my monitor mix, bus, matrix, whatever you want to call it in your console of choice. I never started at unity in terms of the output, because I try to build up to how loud they want it. Because if you start like all the way at unity and is as loud as it can go, you're already kind of hit your ceiling to start out with. So I build that up so that the artist, when they do want the increase in volume, I have the headspace to kind of pull that off. And most of the times, like I'll set it like, my recollection, I'll start it at like -10, and usually it lives there, and I might up it a little bit here and there. I'm trying to think what else I do. Also, just while this seems like a simple thing to do, I also listen to exactly what the artist wants. I don't give them extra junk in there. Like the drummer doesn't need like, you know, synth number 3 that pops up every so often in 2 songs. But I also, I'm trying to think like what else I kind of do on that is, I think other techniques I've also heard from monitoring the level is, in terms of the musicians, is obviously like if you're working with an act night after night, I know, try and figure out what like what o'clock they have their volume for their pack is, and try and match it for yours and see like how loud that particular one is. And well, that also, I'm trying to think, where was I on that? Oh yeah, another, what was it? Oh, I had a good point on that, and I was forgetting. It was like, what was it on the mixing side about? Oh, I totally spaced on the, where did I leave off on?
You were saying checking the o'clock of their pack and trying to match it, kind of listening to their perceived volume, hopefully.
Thank you, John. So that, thank you, John. So the other trick is for, now this is for preserving our own ears, is obviously as monitor engineers, or the dreaded monitors from front of house position that I'm sure we've all been in, is if you have to listen to the pack, like let's say, you know, you have the unfortunate, you have one of those performers who has it really loud, you match theirs, but you only listen to theirs for that. You only listen to there for like a little bit to get it, but then you kind of go back just so you can hear it, because we can go into the science of it. But when you're listening to something blaring and when you're listening to something more at like a talking level, like perfect example, make a mix of whatever song you want that has bass on it, put it at low talking level and then crank it, the bass, and you've not touched the mix. All you've touched is the volume. The bass, because it's a frequency that eats up so much low energy and it requires a lot of power. So the more power transversely you give the music, the more bass will just naturally, even if, like, again, your mix is static. So you do have to listen to it, unfortunately, at those louder levels, but to preserve your hearing, you just pull it right back down. So I'm sure I'll come up with other things, which that's just how I get the conversation started and see what everyone else deals with.
Just to let you know, Scott, it looks like it may very well have been an issue with that link. I've had an email from Michael Lawrence, who also has not been able to join us with his attempts on that link that's on the email. So I'm going to need to sort out that. I've sent Michael Lawrence and Dr. Santucci a paste of the link from Goes to 11. So hopefully we'll get them joining us soon. Jonathan, you work quite heavily with in-ear monitors. Am I right in thinking that you work in a house of worship? Is it that environment?
Yeah, that's right.
And how many sets are you working with on average for an average performance?
We have up to 12, and then I'll have one as a Q pack that we have available.
And are you mixing all of those yourself, or you don't have anyone currently working on personal mixes or anything along those lines?
Well, the band is all on Aviom, so they get to do their own thing. I'm just supplying them stems, and then all the singers are all stereo in-ear mixes where they get to do their thing.
And when you build a mix, are you kind of thinking about, because I know I kind of think briefly about it, but it's not something that's usually in the forefront of my mind when I'm building a mix. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with in-ear monitors, more of wedges. But is SPL exposure something that is in the forefront of your mind when you're setting it up? Do you work through communication? Because other than Dr. Santucci, who's supposed to be with us tonight, other than his DB check, the in-ear SPL analyzer, as far as I'm aware, there's not really any systems that are designed specifically for tracking. I mean, we've got things like Smart Birational Acoustics and other pieces of software that'll track a mic a reference mic in a room, and it'll, as long as it's calibrated, will give you LEQ measurements throughout a performance. But as far as I'm aware, there are no other pieces of software or pieces of equipment that do this for in-ear monitors. So what's your usual system? Is it kind of just conversational with the artist?
Absolutely. And I think, Scott, you hit on it too when you were saying, give them what they ask for, but maybe not everything. I mean, I believe that if you did a virtual sound check situation and played back one of my mixes, it wouldn't sound accurate without the room. And what I'm trying to say there is that I don't need to give them everything in their ears. I only need to give them the things that really are important here, because they're hearing the room around them. They're hearing the low end from the stage. They're standing near subs. So I don't need to put a lot of low end in their mix. So what I'm saying is, if you were just listening to the mix, like, I'll give you an example. If I leave my stage and go back to my green room and I've walked away from the stage and I'm just listening to the in-ear mix, it completely falls apart. It doesn't make any sense, because it's an additive element that's the whole environment. And I think if I try and put everything in there, it just drives the SPL up, right? So I only really need to give them the things that they have to survive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So do you build a mix and then I'm not sure if I got that correctly. Do you build a mix and then bring ambient or audience mics in, or do you kind of start with those general mics and then build around that? What's your process of starting a mix?
As these are mainly singers who are singing to the band, they're not as influenced by, say, the guitars, right? So some of them, like, I put it in two categories. I've got up to 9 BGV singers. They don't really care about the guitars, so I don't actually put them in their mix. What they're listening to is the main vocals, the cues, the guide track. And the more guitars I put in their mix, it clutters. So I keep it quite low. And some of them want to hear more, and they'll say, yeah, can you give me more of that? And others will say, I don't want it at all. So I try and start off as a baseline where I give them all the same thing. And then certain people are unique and will ask for specific things. I've got one of the main worship leaders wants everything centered panned as far as the voices. And I don't understand that for the life of me, because I would want them panned wide or get as much definition in it. But his unique taste is he wants everything down the center. And if you listen to his mix, it's mainly background vocals, and his voice is quite quiet, but he's viewing it as a choir director. Whereas the other worship leader doesn't listen to any of the BGVs. She just wants to hear herself in the guide and very little music. She wants it very cleared out. So I have to know their personal tastes, dependent on what they want. But I'll give you a situation. Like last week, we did a special concert. We had a guest artist come in, and he wanted to hear a lot of music. His MD director came up, and the first thing I do, since we have 2 electric guitars, is I pan them hard left and hard right. And the first thing he said was, this in-ear mix is amazing. I love it. It sounds great. Well, then when the artist came up to do the recording, first thing I noticed is he takes out one ear, and he's relying heavily on the monitors, and he's only got one ear and one side. And the first thing I think about is, well, there goes the main guitarist on the left. He can't hear that anymore. So obviously I have to pan him into the center. But that guy wanted just a ton of everything, and his guitar was super bright. So I have to be really careful to, try and protect him. But on the other hand, he's wanting a little bit of everything. So I kind of have to give him everything. I think I'm rambling at this point. Sorry. But I try and give them as little as possible to try and preserve that level. But on the other hand, if they crank the volume up, I don't really have a strategy to, turn it down, so to speak, other than conversations. So I think that protective element has to come in conversations that I have pre and post service. Yeah.
So you mentioned people taking out one of their ears, which I'm sure everyone that's actually here, that's with us tonight, knows is a terrible
bad idea.
But it seems that musicians and artists don't always know how much of a bad idea that is. How quickly and how kind of forcefully do you jump on that? If you see someone who's determined to do it one-eared, what would your first measure be there? Because obviously the first thing they're going to do, or somewhere along the line certainly, is that they're going to keep asking for it to be louder and louder and louder because they're not getting that binaural summation. So how do you battle someone who only wants one earring?
I personally have a conversation where I say, look, you're risking your hearing, and what can we do to make it so you don't do that? And so I'll use another worship leader that he typically wants to take it out for his song, right? So when he's singing backup, he loves having them both in, but for his song, he typically wants to hear the room. And so just 3 weeks ago, I had a conversation with him, and I said, look, you really shouldn't do that. And I've been happy because since then we worked a little bit harder on localizing things. And sometimes I notice it's a sign of them saying that there's something missing in their mix, like the room mics. And I find that when I get that right, maybe they can keep their ear in place. But sometimes you get to that one performer who just wants to do a little bit of both. And at some point, like this guest artist last week, that's what he chose to do, where his MD director, when both ears were in, was ecstatic with it. So I don't know. It's a personal decision at that point. And if they reject my comments at some point, I feel like, that's as far as I can go.
Absolutely. Elliot, what's your experience with in-ear monitors? Do you do a lot of in-ear monitor mixing?
Yeah, I've done a fair bit, but usually one of the main bands that I work with is they're like a 16-piece like rock orchestra. So there's 4 strings who are all on in-ears, the drummer's on in-ears, and there's 3 singers, and it's kind of a depth situation. So depending on who the singers are, some of them have ears, some of them are wedges, and then everybody else, like keys, guitar, bass, are all on wedges. So it's a real mix, and the like one ear in thing's really interesting. I've got one singer who basically wants to hear, I think it's just comfort, she wants to hear a wedge on the point of feedback. And so the amount of like mixing, like trying to get the in-ears mix, her band leader wanted her on in-ears, and everything she was describing about what she wanted her mix to sound like didn't make any sense to me for the first few gigs. And now I realise I know what she wants. She wants that slightly on-edge thing, and she wants to feel like she's like in the mix rather than her vocal being on top. And if we don't get that right, then exactly what happens is, yeah, it's just like one ear out. And eventually I just went, look, just have a wedge, because I know that's what you want to hear. And like for everybody else, in terms of the front house engineer and the band leader and everybody around her, it's like we'd rather she was on in-ears, but I would just rather she wasn't like doing damage to her hearing. And it's something realistically I've only known about like the last couple of years, that one ear out is a really bad idea, and obviously the reasons why. Because I think like a couple of years ago I probably would have said, oh yeah, just have one if you're not comfortable, and it plugs that gap and it helps your pitching, which is true of earplugs obviously, but not so much something that's actually putting SPL into your ear. And then the other thing which actually I haven't done is stereo, just because we're dealing with that many mixes and there's budget restrictions on how many channels of RF. Typically I've done everything in mono. And then there's another band that's a 4-piece band, but basically has the same budget, and they get stereo for that reason. But I think with the with the bigger band, I'm gonna push for more budget to get stereo in there, because you just what I was saying about, you pan things out, you split things out, the SPL comes down. Obviously, they feel that they're a lot more in control, and when you've got things like ambient mics to push that in, and again, it's something that I do now, but when I started doing these bands, I just kind of, I thought it was a bit of a luxury, or it's just like people being picky, but now I realise it's actually really important to make people feel like they are hearing what they want to hear, and they're in the room that they're in, and it stops people taking their ears out, and it stops people taking one out or both out, or all those kind of issues. So stereo and not pulling out ears are really, really important, and I've only kind of recently in the last couple of years learnt that, I guess.
Yeah, so before we started this discussion, Jonathan brought up the Clang system, and we were discussing the different things you can do with that, with the sort of spatial panning and vertical placement of different elements. But one other thing that's interested me in forking out the £5,000 or whatever it is for the Clang Via. I mean, it's about the same for a Clang Via as it is for a D-Rack by Digicore. I mean, if I'm looking for just outputs and not inputs, then the Clang Via is probably a better buy, because you've got a MADI input and a few other different protocols, Dante and other things. But each one of the V units give you 8 stereo outs. So for someone who was short on outputs from the console like yourself, if someone just threw a Clang unit at you and said, there you go, even if you weren't benefiting necessarily from all of the kind of spatial magic that it can do, it would add 8 stereo mixes to what your desk was capable of doing. And it's a shame that Phil Camp hasn't been able to make it from Clang this evening. He was keen on being here. But he could have explained it all a lot more than me. And if it's not the same, it would only work for me and you, Elliot. I was going to say, he could set up a post-COVID demonstration, but doing an international demonstration might be difficult. Unless there's something he can do, some kind of online Clang demonstration. Maybe he'd be interested in joining us for something Clang related, and we can
there is a demo on the Clang website where if you just stick your headphones in, you can listen to it. It's like one multi-track that is on there. But it's really interesting to kind of hear and kind of go, what does it do out of the box. And obviously there are things with multiple outputs and things that you can't necessarily do on a laptop, but it's kind of cool what it does. I'm interested to try it in the real world.
Yeah, I was playing with the app on my iPhone today, and it's kind of strange that difference between being able to kind of drag an input into the listener's head versus having it. You know, if you were on a regular stereo pan, there's only one version of center. There's not center and center but in front of you, or center and behind you, or center but in front and a little bit lower down. And it kind of gives you these audio effects that you don't really get in a standard system. It's a bit more real world placement. We did briefly have Michael Lawrence join us there. Hopefully he'll come back. Maybe he just saw someone that he didn't want to talk to. Well,
what's interesting, what Elliot brought up is about the one ear thing, is on a related topic, is I've not done a lot of hip hop gigs, but I've heard like horror stories of how loud like some of them can get. And what was interesting, I read on a thread, someone said the trick is, what they do is they put like, I think either a distortion or something, I think it was a distortion or tape emulator, so that when it hits a certain volume, it distorts. Because for some hip hop people, and I'm sure otherwise, they think, oh, when it's distorted, it's loud enough. So if they keep cranking it, because if you have like a high-end system that has so much headroom, you keep cranking, by the time it's distorting, their ears.
It's the reference.
Right. So that's also might be, that's kind of, I don't know if anyone's had that kind of encounter, like even knew that trick. And it's something, it was a trick I always kind of wanted to see. I'm like, it's also is a very specific trick, but it brings up the idea of like, where is someone's loud coming from? Because I remember my days in college, I'd be walking down the hall and I would see people with earbuds and I could hear their music clearly. Yeah. And I'm just like, and, you know, we all like to talk about gear and, you know, we'll have our fun arguments here and there about what's the best sounding. But the thing is, we're also what I like to call power users or whatever, in thinking that oftentimes musicians, unless you're like at the like AAA level, it's like their reference is low end consumer gear. So I think also what might be an interesting conversation also continue being is like, this is my opinion, is like, might be, okay, well, what sounds good to you when you're listening to music? Well, that's not a straight A to B comparison. It just might be, it's like, it's like when we're always told is like, to be a good mixer, whether it be front of house or monitors, it's like, listen to good music. So it's like, okay, well, what to them sounds good? And like, maybe that discussion can also help to alleviate their issues. And I think either Elliot or Jonathan talked about the one ear thing, is like, what's missing there is they want the liveness of the room. And I'd always feel like I see them, John, I think maybe you explained this, like if they're pulling it out, it's like, okay, if you're pulling it out, then how about during that song, I give you more either stage or room mics. That way you're not having to yank it out.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things, guys, and I was a drummer in a former life, and I adopted ears very, very early. And one of the huge adjustments for performers is when you're on stage, you want energy. Yeah. And when you have a wedge on stage and you can hear the PA and whatever you're doing is projecting into the room, it feels powerful. And when you switch to ears, it doesn't feel powerful anymore. And you're looking for that energy and you feed off of that energy. And that's what makes live performances exciting. And that's why going to a live show with a huge PA coming at you is way more exciting than watching it on TV. And the performers feed off of that energy. And so in that transition, most people are going to have to transition from that, even if they're starting out, because most people don't start as performers with ears. Like they start in situations where they're going to live mic nights, or they're starting, like they're they don't come into it like, hey, I think I want to be a drummer or a singer. The first thing I'll do is go by ears, right? That doesn't happen until fairly far on. And so, you know, even if you're a guitar player or a bass player, you're used to having your rig, and when you play even in your own space, you notice that, wow, when I turn up my guitar amp, it sounds different and it's fun and it feels powerful. And for those of us that have been at home mixing, I mean, I turn up the music to hype myself. Of course, I'm checking that it works loud, but it's exciting when it's loud. And so creating that thing, distorting the in-ears, sounds to me like that's an idea worth pursuing, because that sounds like it would feel that energy. And I see performers pull out their ears not because they can't hear something, because they're looking for energy.
Yeah.
And so I talk with them about like readjusting. And when I was a performer, I had to find energy in a new way. Like, okay, everything I need to hear is in here. So how do I get the excitement and the energy that I'm looking for when I'm on stage? Because in the beginning, it feels quite antiseptic. It feels really clean and boring. So
Yeah.
So having the conversation with a performer that you know, and they may not want to, but it's our job to find ways to fulfill that need. But sometimes they need to recognize that long term it's going to be way better for them, because if you're on stage for an hour and a half, 2 hours, say, and you have all that SPL in your ears, you get really fatigued too. And it's like the long-term damages we all know about, but there's performance issues like right on stage during that time, and people think that they can't hear themselves. And the other comment that I would make is, people who have been doing it for a while have a clue about what they need in their ears in order to perform well. People who haven't been doing it for a while don't know. So for example, singers always think that they want more of themselves. I'm generalizing a bit, but this happens a lot. But sometimes it's not. What they're looking for is like a pitch reference. They can't hear the guitar or they can't hear the piano. And so they think, well, they know that they're having trouble finding pitch. And so they think, oh, I need more of myself. I can't hear myself. But that's actually not what the problem is. So being able to listen to what they're listening to and going, oh, I see, all they hear is themselves. Well, that's like life in a vacuum. It doesn't work when the musical interaction isn't there for them to get the references. So like being aware of what somebody needs and helping them figure that out can be a really, really important thing, because they just don't know. And so I as a couple of you know, I come from a studio background, and I've been a producer for a very long time. And so I've mixed like the mix that a singer hears in their headphones when we're recording vocals, and I've done thousands of them. And I've noticed all kinds of interesting things. Like when I turn down a vocalist in their own mix, they start singing harder. When I turn them up more, they start hiding, they start singing softer. And so all of these things can be a little bit, it's a bit of a psychological game. And recognizing that what somebody thinks they want and what they actually need may not always be the answer, and just being open to that and having that conversation with them. Or even, and I'm not saying you want to be sneaky with anything, but saying, hey, I've made a little adjustment, see if you think this is better. I think that maybe you're missing like getting a good pitch reference from a keyboard or a guitar or something like that. Let's see if this helps, and sort of nursing them through it. And like I've even had like one singer who's not very experienced, and she's put the ears in backwards, like in the wrong ears, and then the seal isn't good, and she thinks like her ears aren't working, and it's just like she just didn't know, you know. So those are things to think about.
You brought up the subject of drummers there, Steve. When you, either through your experience as a musician or as a producer, have you ever kind of actively sought to protect your own hearing, or has that just kind of been something that you've just done more intuitively, and you know, if you at the end of a day feel like your ears are fatigued, you know,
I switched to ears because I knew that if I didn't, that I was going to damage my hearing.
Right.
And so, and I'm really glad I did that. And I know that I actually probably have a little bit, because one ear is lost a little bit of high end, and that's from having, I liked my monitor on my left-hand side when I was a performer. The act that I mix with now, when I first joined them, they were all on ears, but the drummer had a big sub on stage because he really wanted to feel it. And he switched to one of these thrones with a driver in it. And that has been like amazing for him. He doesn't feel the need to have that big sub there anymore. It's changed my life out front, because I had to be really careful. He wanted it firing from behind him, so it was essentially 6 feet firing into the kick drum mic. And so for obvious reasons, that could be a bit of a problem. And it changed life for everybody on stage. I still find that the guys on stage sometimes, you know, like when they're wearing ears, they can hear subs, and depending on where we are, venue to venue, we don't always have the same PA. And so when we're with PAs like that are installed in performing arts centers and large theaters and stuff, and they're arranged already in a cardioid pattern, and there's much less bass on stage, it sounds way better out front, but they don't like it as much. And so when we're on an older style rig that's got, like, you know, folded cabinets, and we're not able to do cardioid, depending on what the situation is, or maybe it's even a time constraint, which is a crappy excuse, I know, but I'm not in charge of that in that situation. They like it better. I don't like it better, but the bleed of the bass coming onto the stage, they kind of like. And so, you know, I've thought about actually putting like some other kind of deployment on stage, but it also is like just getting used to it. And like I said, deriving your energy and being aware that the energy you have to sort of reimagine in some ways in order to save your own hearing.
Before we started this evening, or this afternoon, today's discussion, I was actually watching a couple of videos on YouTube about this subject. One of them was Dr. Santucci being interviewed at a trade show, and it was, I'm not sure which brand representative it was that was talking to him, but it seemed to be someone from a company that was drums related, because one of the questions was actually to do with how can musicians protect their own hearing better. And Dr. Santucci actually answered it in reference to drummers, presumably because of the company who the guy was from. And Dr. Santucci was actually saying that it's quite difficult for drummers when compared to other musicians, because it's one of the few instruments that you can't really rehearse quietly with. You know, a guitarist can play an acoustic or an electric with their amp turned down or unplugged. A singer can sing without going through the PA. You know, there's a lot of ways to do things without blowing your eardrums out for a lot of the other members of a band, but not so much for a drummer. I mean, I know there's like practice pads and things, but do either yourself or Elliot, I know you've got a history of drumming. Have either of you kind of taken any measures, like maybe wearing earplugs during rehearsals, or has that just not been something that has kind of worried you so much?
Yeah, so in college and BTEC college, we were like, it was really hammered into us that like everybody should wear earplugs and protect your hearing, and I found it actually really difficult to like to get the power out of the drums. It's like almost when you plug your ears, you almost how to describe it, all of the sort of the background noise goes away, and so like when you then hit the drum, you get like an almost like it's easier to hear what you're doing, so you don't hit the drum as hard. And then like when you're in like a small environment, like a pub gig, it's like I'm actually quite a quiet drummer. I think because of that, my techniques are all kind of based on that rather than like smashing them. And like to a point where it's almost become a problem. And then now what I do is same as Steve, is I went in ears, and like before I did that, I could never understand why drummers wanted, especially kick drum, but themselves in general. I'm like, it's your right foot. Surely you know what that's doing without having to hear it. But then when you go into ears, you're just in this your own little world. And I'm like, yeah, give me the kick and the snare, and like I want some hi-hat and a bit of overheads, and like suddenly I'm building a full mix for myself to feel like it feels without it. And
So
then
if
actually,
sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you're building, because you're kind of on both sides of it there with that conversation, you're seeing things from both an engineer's point of view and from a musician's point of view, as well as yourself, Steve. When you're building a mix or asking for things in your mix from someone else, do you kind of drive the drums hard into the mix, or do you intentionally kind of underrepresent yourself in the mix to encourage yourself to play that little bit harder? Or what's your method there for how much you ask for of yourself in a mix?
I kind of, it's just enough, but then that's the thing for everything. So before I went to in-ears, when I was talking to an engineer, I might have some lead vocal so that I knew, obviously that's the hardest thing to hear because the monitor is like the other side of your drum kit. So I would usually ask for lead vocal and a bit of bass, so that I knew whether where the actual rhythm was hitting, and I knew where all my cues were. And then everything else, like guitars are loud enough on stage. Everything's loud enough, and you don't need to know exactly like, when the guitarist is striking that string exactly, like the timing's going to be there anyway. Whereas within ears, I'm like, I've got everything. Everything's there, and it's in like, it's all small amounts. But if I can, I build my own mix, and like most of the guys that certainly locally that I'm playing for as engineers, like they know I'm a tech, so I can just sort of roll up. A lot of these venues, I'm doing the sound as a dep if they're not there, so that's quite a nice relationship because I can just go, can I just log in? And they're like, yeah, fine. I turn up with my iPad. It's probably already got the with like a QU or an X32 or whatever desk it is. I've probably already logged into that as a front of house tech anyway, so I can just turn on my iPad. It recognises the desk, and I can just sit there and fiddle away. And it makes their sound check easier because they don't have to worry about me. They just hand me an XLR and I'm done. But if I don't do that, one thing that I really like for in-ears, which I try and get all bands to do now, is I saw a touring band come in with a touring engineer at a venue I was doing, and they were using our desks, they were using our everything, I think, but they had like their in-ears set up. And as the guy was doing line check, so they weren't even sort of doing an individual monitor check, as the front of house engineer was getting gains, the whole band just did that. And then as soon as like he'd got his gain sorted, he'd then start adjusting auxes, and when they were happy, they would just go stop, so up, down, stop, and the whole band did that silently on each input. And they were pretty much that rough that they set up during the gain levels was pretty much there, and it was like the quickest sound check I've ever seen. And so even for obviously I do that as a musician. If I don't know that, if I'm not mixing my own monitors, and I kind of try and get all of my bands to do that, and then even as a house tech, if I haven't met the band before, I'll try and explain that concept and just go, stick your hand in the air, and like when you hear the mix start to change, that I've got to you, and like I will get to you. I have seen you, but there's 6 of you and there's front of house to do, and so rather than kind of getting shouted at by however many individuals, I know I've sort of gone on a tangent there, but that's really tangents. The answer is like, how I get my mix on stage, and also just a tip for in-ears and monitors in general. And I think I like to rough it in first, because otherwise people do tend to just push the level up and more me and all that sort of stuff. I think if they're listening to each source as it's being line checked, you don't get that kind of mission creep of everything a little bit louder than everything else.
How about you, Steve? What does your in-ear mix? What would your in-ear mix of yourself sound like these days?
I think that drummers need kick drum, because you need to hear the things that are hard to hear on the stage. Like the snare drum's kind of in front of your face and it's going to bleed through, and that's fine. Different people have different needs, but that, and like Elliot was saying, it's about the bass, which is going to be hard to hear the attacks, even if there's a cabinet on stage. It's usually hard to get the definition of it. And then the vocals are sided, to me, kind of the key things, because they represent like time issues and musical connection to everybody else on stage. Depending on if there's guitar cabinets or not. In my present situation, there are no cabinets on stage. The guitar players are on Kempers and stuff. So like enough where you know where you connect musically, so that it's not just about hearing technically what you need, but also connecting. And then I encourage everybody to keep their mixes low enough. In a lot of situations, including mine, there's a click track, and some people need to hear that more than others. Like the lead singer doesn't really need to hear the click unless like the drums have stopped playing and there's like some breakdown section. But in that situation, everything else is going to be quieter and they'll hear it. The drummer is going to want to hear a little bit more of the click. So, but I encourage drummers to like back off on the things that are going to get in the way of the click, so that, because if you have that click pounding your head all night, that gets pretty fatiguing too. So making room, subtractive stuff is really good, and like focusing on like the 3 or 4 elements that you really need, and then everything else is just kind of filling in, is how I sort of the thought that I have. But I love Elliot's system of holding up your hand and doing that mix quickly across the board. I don't have to build in your mixes every show. Like they always want adjustments, but that usually sort of pertains to what the overall environment is in a bigger space with a bigger PA. They're going to hear stuff to varying degrees, like bouncing off of a wall that like takes like 2 or 3 or 4 seconds to come back to them. And if that's really interfering with what they're doing, in some venues, they might need their ears a little bit more like louder, some things louder, like kick and snare, because like the bleed that they're hearing is out of time and it's difficult to deal with.
You run monitors and front of house from the same console. So do you actually have? This is a little bit off topic, but it still pertains to IEMs. Do you actually have any cues for in terms of monitors throughout the show, or are your band quite happy to kind of be given a mix and then that's it for the show?
So my mix at this point is static, and we don't change it, but there are some differences in how people like to hear certain things. So I have EQ'd their mixes a little bit differently. Overall, just they sort of don't know that really, and I'm not hiding that from them, but you know, like the drummer, for whatever reason, just doesn't want to hear things as bright as the lead singer. Okay. And I can't like EQ like the snare drum and the hi-hat and the vocal differently in his mix. So just the technical limitations. So I have curves on all of their mixes that just sort of tailor to their own personal preferences. And they're all using the same brand of in-ears, but their models are all like a little bit different too. And so like obviously, like I can hear their mixes in my headphone feed, but I don't actually know how that's translating in their actual hardware.
Yeah. I did have a follow-up question, and it's escaped me.
While you're thinking about that,
whatever that jet engine noise was, can anyone else hear that, or is it just me?
I hear that.
Oh.
Yeah, it's Scott.
Well,
it's go on, Scott. Just ask your question.
Well, it's more of an interesting, like, continuing discussion. Steve, you might be aware of this one. Like, it was a mystery I had for the longest time. There were certain records where, like, there was a certain, what I thought was a snare verb sound, but then as I've been doing Sound Gym, I realized it's maybe a verb, maybe not, but one of the other things, it can be the sound of a snare being really compressed. It gets that, like, momentary, like, ka, like, You know that sound when, like, it's more on the rock side. You'll hear this kind of compressed verb, but it's again going back to the natural sounds we hear. That probably why, you know, they take the 1 year out is because they're not hearing that. Because I've had the fortune of or foresight to record some of the shows I've done, and I'll listen to the dry mix, and I'm like, this was like, obviously I knew there's a difference between like being in the room and not, but I was like, something's really missing, and it's many things going on there. It's the room, it's, you know, the system, but it's like that's one of the many things. So I feel like that's also. So I was wondering, Steve, if like not necessarily that trick, but it's like if you've encountered that same thing too, where you've maybe added that little thing from a dry to a wet, where there's something like, oh, okay, or if anyone else too on a similar aspect has run into where they then added something, and then the musician's like, oh, that's what I need.
You know, interestingly, I've been working on making a record for Rob. That's the artist that I work with the last several months, and some of these discussions have come up about reverb, and I think what you're hearing is the room mics, and we don't have that live. At least the vocal mic always ends up being the room mic, and it's horrible. But that's a big part of like anything that you've heard since the 80s. Like the room sound is a big part of like the tail of the drum sound. And I live in Vancouver, and every like hair record in the 80s was made in this city. And there's a studio here where there's a really famous reverb. Like the loading bay was the reverb, and everybody went to Little Mountain Sound, Bon Jovi, Aerosmith, every hair band was here. And so the point is that it's kind of reverb, but it's like a natural thing. So I add, you know, I mean, this is all preference stuff and how we do stuff, but I definitely add reverb to drums that becomes a part of the sound. Like it's not just the space. It's like if you took it away, the sound of the drum feels like it changed. And I'm sure you've all experienced that. But I try to not put that in the ears. And that's not because I'm trying to take something away. I just worry about clutter. So I think that, you know, like I have listened to that clang thing and the you know, the app that you guys are talking about, and that's really interesting to me. I feel like in ears, people need to try and be selective about what's going in there. And I always kind of look at sound like a box, and you can only fit so much into it. And if you're on stage, you're going to need to try and hear the things that you need to hear. And so that's been my approach. I don't know if that's right, but there's a balance between energy and being selective.
Oh yeah, there's an
Steve,
interesting, Steve, this is, it's more on the recording side, but still it piggybacks off what you said. There's an interview with Bob Rock, who's done many things, but to me, the most famous thing he's done has been Metallica's The Black Album. And in one of those classic album series, he said the biggest challenge he had beyond many things, but in terms of mixing, was like, we had to make it go through those two speakers. And because, like, you know, when it sounds in the studio, you're the monitors, it's amazing, but then you're like, yeah, but we got to now get it to a speaker system that, you know, someone's going to have in their car. Or this is even before the phone problem that we have today. Is still, you had to fit all the stuff into your average consumer grade stuff. Now, obviously, as sound engineers, we get usually, hopefully, the nice end stuff, but it's still, especially for front of house, you still have to get it into a stereo field, and it's almost goes right back when you do in-ears, because you just have a stereo field to try and get all that power into it. So, what are you going to say, John?
Let me make sure I'm on. Steve, I think you're completely right about you give them the necessities, and reverb is helpful, but to a point. So in my situation where I have 9 background vocalists and 1 lead, 2 or 3 leads, what I try and do is make it so that the only verb a performer hears is their own personal one, because I just can't give reverb to everyone. It just turns into a wash. So I give them enough on just their mic to inspire themselves, but all the other singers that they listen to, they hear as dry. And I've had people say, well, isn't that, not as flattering? Well, at that point, it's about clarity. They need to hear the clarity to blend. So I think you're completely right that you need to be very selective with how much of that reverb you give them. And it's very powerful and helpful, but it can be easily overdone.
Mm-hmm. I also think that reverb, like in a live setting, like we're already fighting in a live setting, we're already fighting a space. And like, I remember I was at a gig last year and I was like, oh, let me try some slap on this vocal. It's missing something. And then I realized, oh, I've already got 6 of those. Like it was like, you're already fighting that. But I will say that because of the atmosphere that you're in a live situation already has reverb, in some ways it's more acceptable to put some reverb on the vocal, because at least you can put in a reverb that sounds good and it can sort of blend with the atmosphere. Studio, at least right now, unless it's very purposeful, I don't feel like you really want as much of that as people tend to think, because it creates like a farther away feeling. And I've noticed that, like we've all been mixing things like Rhino Johns has got the Mix 45 thing, and we've all been mixing like tracks to practice and stuff. And I noticed that like live mixers put more reverb on vocals than studio mixers were. And I get it, like it works in that situation. I just try and be really mindful that like I want my vocals live to sound like I've done something to them. Like I want them to sound expensive and processed and produced and stuff like that. But like there comes something with that you have to be really careful with, and also in ears, like reverb is like pretty unnecessary swimmy stuff, and it can make something feel very nice, but it can really put a cloud over stuff too. So it's something to be careful
even
with.
like even my recording days, like I was taught, like if you're adding effect, A/B it with your monitors and your headphones, because you put a verb on your monitors, even if you're in a real like well acoustic room, that verb's going to be a whole lot louder when you put your headphones on, because headphones or in ears, you've gotten rid of the space that it's going from here to here. But it's also interesting you said about the reverb thing too, Steve. Was like one of the mixing tracks I was doing still need to finish it, is Billie Jean by Michael Jackson, and I'm just messing around with verbs and just A being the original, and I wasn't trying to match it 100%, but I was just like, wow, like you said, how subtle you have to be in the studio realm with verb, because if you're like 3BD too much, especially like on that track, it just blows it out of the water in the worst way. But it's also live. Yeah, we do have a little bit more allowance with that. I found even in smaller spaces, like to a degree, you have that, because like you said, people are naturally in a reverberant room unless you're in an anechoic chamber, which makes me wonder why you're doing a gig in there. But I found I can get away with a lot more of a wet verb mix. But it's also the idea of too is the verb kind of to bring around to, often for newcomers to IEMs, their biggest complaint is always, I feel like I'm in a coffin, and especially headphone in the studio. So it's like trying to find that mix so like it has some room to it, because as we're talking in a natural room, there is reverb in that. So I'm sure many of us are used to the earphones because we've now done it for so long, but to someone who isn't aware, or it definitely is kind of jarring.
And I guess that comes back to using ambience again. If you've got 2 ambient mics and they want to hear, if somebody says they want reverb, like, is it because they, as a singer, they want to feel slightly flattered, in which case, like maybe you need a little plate or something. But if it's just, I need to feel like I'm in a space, that's what those mics are for. And put them back in the space they're actually in, I think it can really help.
Yeah, I agree. People, if you don't have the ambient mics, the performers feel too isolated. And between songs, my lead singer always pulls one out when he's talking, because he's interacting with people in the audience. He's talking to them and stuff like that. And if they talk and he can't find them, he feels like really like out of place. They'll pull both of them out. He's, you know, and he wants to be interacting and talking to people. And if he feels isolated from that, it's like he's just not having it.
I think
So
the
for
other
me,
point-
those ambience mics. Oh, so
Need a traffic light system.
Mine's brief, so I'll just move to go first. I actually did an art. I think someone had recently talked about specifics of reverb. One of the few times I've done dedicated monitors was for a world music artist, Fatua Tawara. And what was interesting, her manager, and I think her then a little bit later, was he gave me the exact reverb she wanted, with like almost to the millisecond. I forget if it was delay or whatever, but she knew the exact reverb she wanted in her in-ears. And I was just like, which helped me a whole lot. I'm like, cool. We've already like made progress by knowing, okay, you want this style reverb with this setting. We had to like adjust it here and there just because, but it was just like knowing that she had her own preset in her mind. Like, I was just like, all right, cool. Because I had actually set up room mics, but they were like, no, we don't want it. But because they were so used to having different monitor engineers, they just figured, well, most reverbs, of this style sound somewhat similar, so let's go with that instead of like an ambient mic. And I was like, interesting way to go about it. Like, obviously, I'm sure if I worked with her on multiple shows, I could convince her, hey, let's do ambient mics. But it was an interesting tool for that kind of level where it's like, you're touring, but you're not carrying crew with you beyond the basics of like get to the show. And
yeah, and it's straight. They've obviously taken the time to find out what the settings were of someone who gave them a reverb that they were happy with. It's odd that they've never decided to actually tour with an engineer. I mean, I suppose it works out a lot cheaper to ask an engineer, what settings did you use? You know, how many milliseconds of pre-delay did you put on that hall? You know, that's a lot cheaper than it is to say, do you want to come out on the road with us?
It's a budget issue. I know a violin player that tours by herself with tracks, and on her rider is a particular reverb machine with a particular setting. And that's like, she'll work with the house person, but you have to get this box and put it on this setting and add that, and that's my sound.
Right.
And I'm sure other people have had this as well.
Go on, Elliot, it's your turn.
Talking over everybody. Yeah, no, I'm sure other people have had this as well, but I work with front of house engineers who have their very specific requirements of what they want me to do as a monitor engineer for their artist. And I think it's the same as like, if the artist could afford a monitor engineer, they would. But ultimately, they know, management's paying for the engineer. They're going to be out the front, making it sound good out the front. But part of their job is just keep a check on me, make sure that I'm doing my job right, make sure their artist's happy. And it's an easier day for me, really, if I listen to them, because I know that, the artist is going to be happy and they're touring with them. They're going to be able to tell me what they want and what they don't want in their mix.
Yeah, it's usually, I find at that level, like at least my experience up in Vermont, where it's the level before you can get the truck to carry your gear in. If your gear if they're renting gear at location and all that, they typically don't bring it, because there's so much little like but like, especially pre-COVID era, where it's like, if you bring an engineer that's another person on payroll and not bringing that, because I'm sure someone who's toured can attest to this. Like, just it's more people you need to bring, especially when you're like just trying to not be in the red. And I'm sure we've all wanted to be, because I've done acts where I'm like, man, I would love to tour with this one, but I knew it was like, okay, they just barely made it. In fact, I did an internship where most of the acts that came through were in that category of either they were on their way up or on their way down, or they had plateaued and they were not going to ever get any bigger. And bringing crew with them on the road just did not make sense. So they just most of the time had a well put together writer asking for what they wanted. And the manager knew, okay, yeah, this color and these kind of lights, and it needs to be this kind of sound. And then the artist would spend time in sound check from there. which I've gotten pretty good at doing those.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if tours cutting back on what personnel they're touring with actually starts getting more and more popular. You know, if things are even half of the situation that they are at the moment for any amount of time going on from this, then, you know, if you've got a choice between touring with a front of house engineer and a monitor engineer, or if you know if it's actually physically possible, touring with one engineer that can do both, or relying on house crew to do certain elements that maybe would have been taken over by touring crew in the past, you know, that's going to save space on tour buses. It's going to save. I mean, not many tours are making people share hotel rooms that I know of, but I'm sure there are some out there. It's going to save on people sharing hotel rooms. It's going to save on costs massively. But if you've got a house lighting engineer that's operating from a permanent box where their console lives, and you don't have to park a console next to your own, these are kind of considerations that people are probably going to start taking into account in the coming months. You know, it's difficult. Companies, I think it was Soundcraft, made one console that did have the ability to output DMX, and I'm really glad that never seemed to make it like into popular use, because that's management's like wet dream. That's like, right, I've got I only need to pay for one console and one crew. But
Shoot me.
yeah, I mean, it's one thing trying to operate front of house and monitors, but trying to operate two different departments is, you know, you're asking for trouble. I mean, maybe if you're talking lights and video, if it's kind of very limited amounts from each of those departments, but sound and lights is not a good idea, I don't think, unless it's a very, very automated show. But while we're on the subject of what you said there, Scott, about, you know, this is kind of at the point where it's people that are just before reaching truck touring level. So while it's fresh in my mind talking about people changing levels, Jonathan, you might be you might be one to answer this, but hopefully someone can answer. Has anyone got any suggestions or like any insight into what would you say, mostly to the engineer, not to the person doing it, but people going from universal fit IEMs to custom IEMs. If you were talking to a younger engineer that was maybe touring with a band that were just about to all make the change from universals to customs, is there anything in terms of mix or even anything as straightforward as overall like mix levels? Anything that you would change on that sort of switch over?
Well, I mean, all I can say is, you know, custom fits are obviously better, and you can run them lower because the seal's better. So, I mean, to me, it's better, but it's money.
Yeah. So from an engineer's point of view, you know, you kind of stick with the same mix, but you know, the first time someone puts those customs in, maybe try them for the first time with it a couple of dB knocked off, and then kind of work, you know, just feel it out from there. Yeah.
Yeah, and those customs will probably take low end a whole lot better because the foamy ones just don't show that very well.
Yeah.
And my phone's about to die here, so if I disappear, my battery's about shot.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, has anyone got any questions or anything that they wanted to? I mean, it's unfortunate that Dr. Santucci. I'm assuming that it's been the issue with the link that's in the email. I'm going to need to obviously change the signature of the Mixing Mondays email address so that it has it copied in whatever the other fashion was that actually worked. And Michael Lawrence kind of appeared as a picture of himself with a budgie or something on his shoulder. So maybe he's training to be a pirate or something. But he didn't stay for long and didn't say anything. So maybe he's having technical issues. But it looked like the link finally worked for him. Has anyone got anything else that they actually wanted to discuss, or any questions that anyone else here might be able to answer? Or maybe if people have got questions that they actually want to ask Dr. Santucci, then maybe we can write them down and drop him an email and see if we can either get him on another session with a link that actually works, or if he's busy from this point onwards, maybe he'll just reply to us with an email answering some questions. Has anyone got anything that they actually wanted to discuss with him? Just generally wondering what was
my
going
first
on.
idea is just like, has anyone developed a universally accepted way to measure SPL and IEMs? Because for the most part, we have a few universally agreed upon ways to measure, SPL from front of house. So we can be, hey, it's over this amount, we should turn it down. But it's like IEMs, it's like we can like guesstimate like how much signal we're sending to the pack, but it's like we don't know how much at the end of the day is going into that earbud.
Yeah, I mean, don't hold me at all to this, because I've kind of just read what I can find on the internet, but it seems that the system that they've got, DB check, you kind of tell it which components you're using, so which IEM model it is, and the other bits and bobs. I'm not sure on how much detail it goes into, but we will find out all of this either by getting Dr. Santucci back on or via an email. I believe you basically tell it what components there are in a given system, and then feed it a reference signal, and by the voltage level of the reference signal and its own internal reference for those components, it can then tell you what the end result is in terms of SPL at any given time, and then can track that and work out what the exposure is over a given time. Which was one of the reasons I really wanted Michael Lawrence from Rational Acoustics to come on, because from my understanding of Dr. Santucci's system, it seems to me like there should be no reason, without being an audiologist or an expert in ear simulator models. I'm not sure what the reason is why you can't just do the same thing with SMART. Why you can't feed any given IEM into SMART at a known SPL level, and then send it a reference level after that. I mean, it would be...
Yeah, there's got to be some way, because my first thought was like immediately, I'm like, maybe make a I don't know, for lack of a better term, a model of a head, and you can plug it in there, but that just seems a little too complicated. But I think unless someone else has like some discussion topic or questions, I think we've kind of hit a nice kind of end of our discussion. So
yeah, before we go, did anyone not see? I posted a link to a website. I think they're called ADV, and they do. I think it's about $150. They'll do you custom, if you've got a mold taken of your ears, they'll do you custom inserts for almost any brand of headphones. I mean, they do custom in-ear molds for Apple headphones. on the website, you can basically select what model of headphone you've got, what color you want, and then send them your mold, and they'll send you back a custom mold that your existing headphones, whether it's universal IEMs or whatever, will fit into. I'm not sure how good they are. If anyone ever gets to a point where they've got $150 that they want to spend, and just to find out how good these things are, then please let me know. I think they claim something like 25 or 26 dB attenuation, which if I could plug, my in-ears are more like audiophile kind of aimed. They're a pair of FIO FH7, yeah, and they sound great, but they're not customs. If I could plug them into a custom plug in my ear for only another $150, £150. I mean, the rates are not that much different anymore. Then that's definitely something I'd look at buying in the future. If I knew that it was a significant improvement on universal tips. So yeah, there's a post somewhere on Goes to 11 if you can't find the website.
I'm looking for your post. I'm not finding it, but doesn't mean it's not there. They're not always easy to find.
No, I know they kind of just disappear into the ether. And sometimes I post things and I put like the subject on it, and I'm not sure whether putting one subject over another affects who sees it, and if you kind of choose one over the other,
Same.
whether you're gonna miss, like, people are gonna miss out on it because they don't necessarily follow a given subject. But yeah, those are worth looking at.
What's the company called again, Liam?
I think they were called ADV. I'll try and find them, and I'll stick a fresh post on Goes to 11. I'll reach out to Dr. Santucci's office again and let them know what happened with the link. Fingers crossed, we can kind of reschedule. If not, I'll see if he's maybe got some kind of electronic press kit or something that they maybe send out to let people know about the SPL software or hardware. Well, I'm not sure how much of it's involved. Yeah, but we'll try and work something out. But
Cool.
Okay, well, thanks, guys.
No problem. Thanks for
Thank
coming.
you. And actually, a little preview of it'll be next week's, because we're doing bi-weekly. We're going to be, the general topic will be dealing with difficult clients and crew. So that'll be a fun one, and seeing how so we'll give you some time to remember those days when we were touring or working. They'll come again, but it's just more, also just to share stories, but figuring out, like, how do we deal with them? And strategies of both, like, how to deal, because it's, yes, we've all had our stories about divas, but it'll also be our stories about crew divas. All right. Well,
Excellent.
thank you all for coming by. Thank you all for coming by, and see you at the next one.
Okay, thanks for hosting,
Thanks,
guys.
guys.
Thank
you.
Be safe.
Be safe.